Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're talking about a perfume house that doesn't get really any conversation in the online fragrance community, and it's the perfume house known as Parfums d'Orsay. A lot of you people, if you know of Parfums d'Orsay, you only know about it because the recent videos that have been put out on this house cover the most recent relaunch of the brand since 2015, the third such attempt at relaunching this house since it originally died in 1983. The original house ran from 1908 until 1983, and then once it collapsed, it was revived again in 93, a decade later, collapsed again, revived in 2007, collapsed again, and then most recently revived in 2015. But that version of Parfums d'Orsay, which is the version currently selling fragrances, neither has the rights to any of the names for the classic fragrances, nor do they publish any version of those fragrances. So it is, for all intents and purposes, a different, unrelated house. You cannot buy any of the classic fragrances that vintage enthusiasts know, if they know about this house at all. It's fairly obscure. So the point behind Parfums d'Orsay, and perhaps one of the reasons why it is so obscure, is it was an attempt by American investment capital to enter the space dominated by the French. So to make that a little more concise, a little more clear for you guys, 1908, when Parfums d'Orsay launched, was the height of the high perfumery from French brands. Before World War I, before designers began releasing their own perfumes, before any of that, we're talking about the times when brands like Guerlain and Houbigant and Pinot ruled the world, or if you were in the UK, Floris, Penhaligon's, things like that. Coty was just getting his move on at that time period, and so was the original version of Avon called California Perfume Company. But by and large, if you were buying perfume at the turn of the 20th century, it was one of those high French houses, and it was really expensive. Perfume wasn't for the average Joe. The average Joe bought colognes, right? Stuff like 4711 or Atkinson's, Yardley's. That's what was available back then. So these U.S. investment people, these bankers basically, and early Wall Street investors, they wanted to break into that market that was more or less cornered by Guerlain. And Caron had only been around for 4 years. So I know you're going to say, what about Caron? And I'm going to say, well, what about Caron? They launched in 1904. This is 1908. So they hadn't even quite made their own mark yet. Not really, not specifically. So that's the thing to take away here, guys. Now, going back to the beginning, in 1908, it was an investment group, okay, consisting of a guy named Siegfried and then, I guess, Sally Berg. I don't know how they were related, if they were spouses or they were siblings, but Siegfried and Sally Berg launched Parfums d'Orsay in New York in 1908. Leo Fink and M. Van Dyke, D-Y-C-K, Dick Dyke, I don't know. But Leo Fink, M. Van Dyke, Siegfried and Sally Berg, the four of them came together, put up money, and then guess what? Parfums d'Orsay was a going concern, was a thing. The idea was they chose the d'Orsay name because its association with aristocratic and luxurious imagery, because, if you know your history, during the Second Empire, Napoleon III, Alfred Gimrod d'Orsay, he was the first dandy. He invented the whole idea of shaving your face, keeping your hair short, fancy sideburns, having slope-shouldered suits, nice stovepipe hats. The whole putting on the Ritz thing, that was a really early thing. And he only lived for about 50 years, man. He was born in 1801, died in 1852. He had some kind of infection. That's how he died. So it wasn't natural causes. He could have lived longer, but, that's how it was back then. They didn't really have a lot of good, medical science in the early 19th century. Just barely understood alcohol and germs back then. But his name was chosen, and they actually went so far as to purchase a castle for their headquarters in France. So they were New York-based investment, but they were trying to make the perfumes and based themselves out of France. So that's bizarre in and of itself, but I mean, we're talking 1908 here, guys. I don't know what to tell you. So Alfred d'Orsay, the Comte d'Orsay, Alfred Guillaume, Gabriel Gimrod d'Orsay. Yeah, man, he had so many middle names. What is up with that? But he was an amateur artist. Obviously, I told you he was a dandy. And he was also a man of fashion, whatever you could consider that back in the 1800s. So the thing is, though, the original four investors, they got out pretty quick. I think they realized just how difficult it was to try and have a French perfume house based out of France, but be from New York. So they sold to a French person. Of course they did. This New Yorker-based fake French aristocracy perfume house sold to real French people. So that is such a weird mindfuck. We're going to create this fake version of Guerlain, realize that we're in over our heads, and then we're going to sell it to some French people to make it actually French, and then walk away, right? Take our golden parachutes, as they say, right? So in 1916, Parfums d'Orsay was acquired by Jean-Louis Guerin, I'm going to say. I'm terrible with these French names. But Théophile Bader was the other person that Jean-Louis Guerin worked with. And the two of them became co-owners of Parfums d'Orsay. And then they eventually took the formula that were created under the original leadership of the Bergs. They took that formula and they tweaked it out. Originally, we just had basically colognes and perfumes. They began making more varied versions of everything. So there was a toilette. There was just a wider selection of the smells. But they also realized they needed perfumers to make new things too. So by 1926, they had hired on Henry Robert. Now you're going to be like, hey, wait a minute. Are you talking about the Chanel Henry Robert, the one that made Pour Monsieur in 55, the one who made Number 19 in 71, the one who made Cristal in 74? And yes, that Henry Robert. The Henry Robert, the second house perfumer for Parfums Chanel, who replaced Ernest Beau, he was originally the house perfumer for Parfums d'Orsay from 1926 until 1933. And as house perfumer, Henry Robert was actually responsible for fragrances like Le Dandy, which is probably the biggest thing that he did with Parfums d'Orsay, because Le Dandy was effectively the answer to Chanel number 5. You know, since we're talking the 20s here, number 5 was extremely popular. Everyone wanted their own version of number 5. So effectively what happened was Henry Robert was commissioned to make their number 5. So he made an aldehydic floral chypre fragrance. Le Dandy has much less aldehydes than number 5 does. It has more flowers, more oak moss, more aromatics. It's much chewier, okay? So number 5 is very musky. Number 5 is very resplendent, very rounded, very blended, right? Le Dandy is chewier, much mossier, much more vetiver, okay? Woodier. The rose is a bit more punchy on the face. But you can tell it was an attempt to get in that wheelhouse of number 5. And then also, you had some pretty big players doing bottles. So Baccarat did bottles for Parfums d'Orsay, and Lalique also did bottles for Parfums d'Orsay. So Parfums d'Orsay bottles can fetch just as much money as some vintage Guerlain bottles can, because they're made by Lalique and by Baccarat. Baccarat and Lalique both made bottles for Parfums d'Orsay. Now the thing is, Jacques Guerin, who was Jean-Louis Guerin's son, would eventually be sent to learn perfumery, because the idea was they wanted to make this a real family thing like Guerlain did, right? So the Guerin family wanted to become like the Guerlains and have a dynasty of perfumers. So they eventually sent the son, Jacques Guerin, to learn perfumery. And he did. He studied chemistry, then perfumery, and then after he came back, he joined his mother's company. And for a while, he was just house perfumer. So the thing is, it's kind of funny, but Jean-Louis Guerin's son, Jacques Guerin, was the house perfumer. So it was like mother and son. Instead of Creed with father and son, it was mother and son. And a lot of the fragrances that would come out after that, especially the World War II and post-World War II stuff, things like Intoxication, things like Divine, things like Arôme Toi, all of those things would be products of Jacques Guerin. He would perfume all those things. So then you've got, in 1936, the Jean-Louis Guerin would buy out her investors completely and then take the whole thing off the stock market. So it would actually leave the New York Stock Exchange in 1936 completely, and it would become privately owned because Jean-Louis would buy it all out and so they would take the company private basically after that, which I guess is the only reason why it survived World War II, right? So, and then, good old Jacques Guerin took his mother's place eventually and became the president of Parfums d'Orsay, actually the same year that the mother, Jean-Louis, would buy out the investors. The son would become president in her place. And then from 1936 until 1983, he was the president. He still perfumed for the house, but he would also bring in other perfumers. They would contract out like most houses do. He would do a few things himself, contract some things out, but would effectively be the administrator for Parfums d'Orsay until their death in 1983. So then after that, like I said, we have the resurrections, the 93 resurrection, and then in 95, a couple new fragrances that never existed prior hit the market. The first resurrection in 93 actually uses the bottles I want to show you now. So this bottle here is from the 93 resurrection. So if you see any Parfums d'Orsay bottles on the market, eBay, Fragrance X, Fragrance Net, wherever it is you buy your fragrances, especially gray market stuff, because these are all discontinued. If you see d'Orsay bottles like this, that is from the 93 era. Some of these did run until the 2000s, okay? Because that 93 era actually ran until about 2001, 2002, before the company went kaput. 2007, it would be resurrected again. The first time it was resurrected, it was by two people named Claude Broll and Alain Langier. And they would actually base out of the UK. They would base out of the UK, and they would resurrect a lot of the older fragrance styles in the 90s and then launch some new ones, like I said. Then once they went kaputski, 2007, a new owner was found, someone named Mary Hewitt. And Mary Hewitt, who is also based out of the UK, would pick up these same bottles, keep this stuff going, but then she would start phasing out some of the older fragrances and doubling down on newer stuff. So each new owner, each new resurrection was a further step towards modernization and getting rid of old stuff. But these bottles didn't survive that second collapse, though. So after that second collapse, the brand was resurrected in 2015, and those bottles take on a completely different shape. They are like these cylindrical bottles with a visible, like, colored straw in the middle, and they have initials like DR, ZX, VW, or whatever, and then completely unrelated fragrances that have nothing whatsoever to do with anything related to the original d'Orsay company, any of the original d'Orsay perfumes. It is, in effect, a brand new niche brand that just happens to have the old name of d'Orsay on the label, which is a bit tragic, honestly. So reportedly, the first fragrance launched in 1908, okay, which was called Bouquet d'Orsay originally. That fragrance was supposedly a preservation of a formula created by Count d'Orsay himself. And the way it goes is Count d'Orsay dabbled in perfumery and created various personal formula starting in 1830 and manufactured these things exclusively for his female friends. So, a bit of a lecher there. He would make these perfumes, give them to his various, female friends. A lot of them were probably escorts and courtesans and whatnot, and entice them to come back to his home so he could bump the uglies or whatever. So you get the perfume gift and maybe some syphilis to go along with it. I don't know. But anyhow, that's what he did. Those perfumes, blah, 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 they were somehow preserved through notation. And supposedly the first fragrance, which was Bouquet d'Orsay, later renamed Etiquette Blue, by the way. Etiquette Blue and Eau de Cologne are the same as Bouquet d'Orsay. It's all the same fragrance. But that original 1908 fragrance was basically supposed to be his signature scent that he made in the 1800s when he was still alive. Now let's talk about the perfumes themselves, since I've given you all the history that's fit for telling. Let's get down to the perfumes. Well, I've smelled some of the original stuff from before the first resurrection. I've got small, like nip-sized bottles of Divine, of Intoxication. Okay, I've smelled some of those things. And they're good. Do they really hold a candle to Guerlain or Caron? No. No. Not even in the least bit. I would say the original classic d'Orsay fragrances at best were comparable to Petou, Lanvin, Chanel. Now that's really esteemed company, okay? That is not a bad crowd to be in. That is honestly, if your stuff is comparable to classic Lanvin, classic Petou, classic Chanel, you're in good company. But you're not on that, exalted plane that Guerlain and Houbigant and Caron sit on. So you're batting around with, Joy and stuff like that, number 5. You're batting around with stuff like Arpège. You're not batting around with stuff like Mitsoko or Le Herbe Bleu or any of that stuff. You're not batting around with Après Lande. You're not in that exalted crowd, but you're still with the cool kids because, again, Lanvin and Petou, Chanel, it's a good crowd to be in. Now, my personal favorites are some of the early masculine releases that were not labeled as masculine back then, but clearly are. Like, which, by the way, the original Etiquette Blue / Eau de Cologne / Bouquet d'Orsay, that's an orange blossom fragrance. If you want a fragrance that is basically like an Eau de Cologne but extended, like an Eau de Cologne with a sandalwood, oak moss, like a musky base, a little bit powdery, granted, because it's from 1908, okay? It's going to be powdery from 1908, but it gives you that clean orange blossom smell that will linger on your skin for hours and hours and hours. So imagine like a really old version of like Neroli Portofino or something like that, right? Neroli Portofino, but with no aquatics. Take the aquatics out. Instead, do a classic powdery, musky base, but with the Neroli top note. That is what Etiquette Blue is, and it is fantastic. Chevalier d'Orsay is also really good. 1911 for that one. Chevalier d'Orsay is like a really early proto-citrus aromatic chypre. So if you like stuff like Moustache, you like stuff like Pour Monsieur by Chanel, you like Monsieur de Givenchy, you like those classic citrus aromatic chypres, go all the way back to 1911, and Chevalier d'Orsay is basically that, but with Artemisia. Lots of Artemisia, okay? You have to like Armoire to really dig this fragrance. You gotta like that mugwort, that wormwood. If you don't, you won't like this. But I do. I like Artemisia. And you stick Artemisia into a really antique citrus aromatic with a good labdanum oak moss base, I'm there for it. I love it. I want some more of it, actually. Arôme Toi is also really good. Arôme Toi is an early fougere from 1943. It was not gendered. It was kind of marketed for everyone. So some ads showed a guy. Some ads showed a girl on a swing. So it was labeled to everybody. But it was basically an aromatic fougere, hence the name Arôme Toi. It was the third arôme, I guess, the third aroma that Jacques Guerin had created when he was, since 36, he was house perfumer and president. He made Arôme Toi. And Arôme Trois kind of really reminds me of a Shalimar with all the vanilla and iris taken out. So there's a little bit of iris powder in that. Some people will say it has a Band-Aid smell to it. But if you want something like a Tom Ford Noir Eau de Parfum, something like a Shalimar, but you want less handbag, you want less powder, you want more lavender, more geranium, you want to lean more into that fougere structure, a little bit of vanilla, but it's a very classic film noir, 1940s. It's very much of its time. It is very painfully of its time. But if you want that classic, you know, smoking a cigar, wearing a fedora, driving a big old car with a humpback, you want that vibe with the muffled jazz trumpet playing in the background. You want that vibe? You want Arôme Trois. It's exactly what you want. Now for this fragrance. This is Le Nomade. Originally, this was launched in 1973 as Nomad. There's no Le attached to it. And Nomad was the last men's fragrance and the only official men's fragrance, because it was the only fragrance actually labeled as for men. Arôme Trois was not. Chevalier d'Orsay, despite the name, was not. They were just, anybody can use them. Guys like them more, but anyone could use them. It was that time period before we had Pour Homme, right? Pour Homme wasn't really a thing back then. Not so much. But this was the first deliberately men's marketed fragrance, and also the last, because they wouldn't do any more, and d'Orsay would shut down in 83. They'd go bankrupt in 83. But in 73, they made this. It's a very interesting fragrance. I'm wearing it. It's got this weird milky chewiness to it. So it inherits some of that chewy chypre base thing that you find in vintage La Dandy, that you find in vintage Chevalier d'Orsay. There's this certain chewy, aromatic, herbal quality that the house just keeps carrying forward from their old days, and they carried it forward into this fragrance too. But it's got jasmine in it, it's got rose in it, it's got a whole stonking heck load of herbs. So if you don't like herbal fragrances, you don't want to go near this. Lots of herbs, very chewy base. Like I said, I've been using that word. I used it like 15 times so far. So chewy, 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 chewy like a granola bar. And then you've got vetiver in here too. Big old honking slug of vetiver. And it's not the smoky vetiver. It's more of that reunion bourbon vetiver, that lighter, grassier. Think Givenchy. If you like the vetiver in the Givenchy Eau de Vetiver, again, you'll like this. It's in that same neighborhood. Very green. The rose and jasmine keep it light, okay? That milkiness is kind of bizarre, but that's just the way the jasmine and everything and the white florals are playing with that extra, you know, heavy base, that extra aromatic, like I said, chewy kind of base going on there. Lots of herbs and stuff to get in your face. Now, the Le Nomade version, which would come out in 2000, this version is an Eau de Parfum. The older ones were Eau de Toilette and Eau de Cologne. This one is a bit, I guess, rounder, thicker. You can tell they were having to adhere to IFRA restrictions in 2000. The first wave of those restrictions came through, not as heavy as now, but they had to cut down a little bit on oak moss. So this is not a moss bomb. The older ones are going to be very mossy from the 70s, if you can find them. They're basically extinct in the wild. You can't find bottles anymore of the original Nomad. If you do, it's probably going to be like $1,000. But if you find it, you won't want to wear it anyway. You'll want to put it in a fucking museum. But if you get this one, it's still really good. Very odd fragrance, though. I can see why it didn't sell well. But then again, that can be said for everything that d'Orsay has made. All of their fragrances, including the classic ones, were all just really odd, really left of center, did things a little differently, and they left their mark, but apparently they have been forgotten. Time has reclaimed them. That's it, guys. That is my video on Parfums d'Orsay. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will catch you next time.